You know, it's a question a lot of us in the Philippines have probably asked at some point. Why does some of the biggest, most talked about legal cases just seem to fall apart? Today, we're going to dig into the real reasons why, looking at the cracks in the system through the lens of some truly landmark cases.
Right? We've all seen it happen. A huge case explodes in the news, everyone's talking about it, and then it just drags on for years, sometimes even decades. And the ending, often, it's a controversial acquittal or it just fizzles out. So what is really going on here?
To really get to the bottom of this, we have to look at the very foundation of the justice system itself. Let's start by uncovering some of the deep, structural flaws that can doom a case before it even gets off the ground. Now, our source material brings up this fascinating and honestly kind of scary concept called the weaponization of law. This is when the rules of the game, the legal procedures themselves, get turned against the search for truth. Instead of being a tool for justice, they become a weapon to get a case thrown out on a technicality.
So, how does this actually happen? Well, think of it like a domino effect. It all starts with a flawed investigation. From there, the next domino falls. The evidence gets compromised. Maybe it's lost, maybe it's mishandled, maybe the all-important chain of custody is broken. By the time it all lands on a prosecutor's desk, the case is just riddled with holes. And poof, it's dismissed, often without a single argument about what actually happened.
And right there, that's a massive vulnerability. You've got the police, whose job is to investigate and gather all the evidence, and then you have the prosecutors, who have to take that evidence and build a rock-solid case. But what happens when the evidence they get is shaky from the start? That conflict point is where so many cases begin to crumble, long before a judge ever hears them. So who's on the front lines seeing all this happen day in and day out? The lawyers. And they're often caught in a really tough spot, walking this ethical tightrope between their duty to respect the courts and their professional mandate to demand a better system. I mean, look at this. This conflict is literally written into their rules. On one hand, you've got Canon 11, which says lawyers must show respect for the courts. Simple enough. But on the other hand, the Integrated Bar of the Philippines is literally tasked with improving the administration of justice. So what are you supposed to do when you believe improving the system requires you to criticize it?
But here's where it gets really interesting. The Supreme Court itself gave us an answer. In an opinion, it basically said that when a judicial error is so bad that it leads to a total failure of justice, speaking out isn't disrespect, it's actually an ethical duty. It's part of that very mandate to make the system better for everyone.
All right, enough with the theory. Let's get into the real-world evidence. We're going to open up the case files on a few landmark cases that perfectly illustrate these systemic failures in action. First up, the infamous Vizconde massacre case. The crime happened way back in 1991. It took 9 years to even get a conviction in 2000. And then, a full decade later, in 2010, the Supreme Court acquitted everyone. A 19-year legal nightmare that ended with more questions than answers. So, why did it all fall apart? Well, the main eyewitness testimony was eventually deemed unreliable. But the real knockout punch? Vital DNA evidence, a semen specimen, was lost. And it was lost while in the custody of the state. The Supreme Court said that failure was a denial of due process. Basically, the system itself failed to protect the very evidence needed to find the truth. Now, let's look at a case that highlights a completely different, but just as damaging, systemic failure. Delay. It all starts with this number, 7. That's how many counts of graft Imelda Marcos was convicted of by the Sundagan Bayan back in 2018, a clear-cut guilty verdict. And this is where you can see how delay becomes more than just a backlog. It becomes a tactic. The conviction was in 2018. An appeal was immediately filed. And years later, as of now, the case is still pending review in the Supreme Court. This is how a conviction, a guilty verdict, can get stuck in judicial quicksand, delaying accountability until people forget. And that whole theme of justice delayed is justice denied, it's front and center in the case involving former Senator Leila de Lima. She was detained for years, and her case brought up some really serious questions about the constitutional right to a speedy trial. So what happened in the end? Well, one of her cases was dismissed, not because she was proven innocent, but because the prosecution's evidence was, simply put, just too weak. The court basically said, you haven't even shown us enough to continue this trial. Crucial evidence like CCTV footage was never even produced. It's yet another case that ended on a technicality, not on its actual merits. Okay, for our last case file, we're looking at a literal race against time. This was after the 2022 election. A petition was filed with the Supreme Court. The goal? To force the preservation of digital transmission logs, key data needed to investigate claims of manipulation. The clock was ticking because that data wasn't going to be around forever.
And this brings us to a really critical question. Because this digital evidence was said to be automatically deleted, the court's failure to act quickly meant the evidence just disappeared. The case became moot, a legal term for, well, there's nothing to decide anymore. It's a stark reminder that sometimes not making a decision is the decision, with permanent consequences.
So, after going through all these case files, the one question that's probably on your mind is, what now? Is there a path forward? Is it even possible for a system with such deep-rooted problems to actually fix itself?
Let's just quickly recap the pattern we've seen because it's pretty clear. At the investigation stage, things are compromised. At the adjudication or court stage, they're plagued by incredible delays. And the end result? Accountability gets completely undermined, and public trust in the entire system just erodes. So, are there any real solutions on the table? Well, our sources point to a couple of big structural ideas. One is to create specialized expert police forces for agencies that handle really complex cases. Another is to establish a totally independent probable cause office to make sure that from day one, investigations are solid and shielded from outside political pressure.
These are ideas meant to fix the machinery of justice, but it all leaves us with one last fundamental question, one that goes way beyond any single policy. And it's this: if a system is truly broken, can it ever really fix itself?